He was a man who had everything: wealth, power, and influence. But on one lonely night in Phoenix, his life collided with two fragile souls who had nothing. Under the dim glow of a streetlight, Vincent Hale discovered twin girls curled up in a cardboard box, clutching each other against the cold. What he heard next shook him to the core. "You don't have to take both of us. She's nicer." In that moment, the walls he had built around his grief began to crack. This wasn't just chance, it was destiny, a turning point that would test his heart in ways he never expected. Sometimes the most powerful stories of family are not written in blood, but in choice. The choice to stay, to protect, to love when it matters most. Stay with us and subscribe to the Retold Stories for more journeys that remind us of the extraordinary power of compassion. Vincent Hale sat in the driver's seat of his sleek black Jaguar, its engine humming softly like a restless animal waiting for command. Outside, the glow of the Mitchell Foundation Gala shimmered in the distance, a world of chandeliers and velvet curtains that bore his name in gold letters. Inside, the air felt suffocating. This was supposed to be the night that honored his late wife and daughter, the annual celebration built around their memory. Yet tonight, the thought of stepping into that ballroom felt unbearable. His hands stayed frozen on the steering wheel, his chest weighed down by silence so heavy it threatened to crush him. For years he had drowned himself in obligations, speeches, and handshakes, as if the rituals of success could mask the hollowness inside. But grief has a way of lingering in the quiet, whispering through every empty corner. And tonight, the silence was louder than ever. He turned the car away from downtown, letting instinct guide him through streets he had not traveled in years. Neon lights flickered, buildings slouched with age, and alleys opened like wounds along the city's edges. It was there, on a forgotten street littered with trash and shadows, that something caught his eye. A collapsed cardboard shell leaned against a dumpster, sagging from rain and time. At first, it was just another piece of the city's debris. Then he saw movement, a small shift, the faint stir of fabric. He braked, heart tightening. Two tiny figures curled inside, barely visible through the folds of cardboard, huddled together as though the world had abandoned them. Vincent stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching on glass, the night air cold against his skin. He approached slowly, as though afraid the fragile image might vanish if he moved too quickly. Underneath worn hoods and tangled hair, two girls no older than 6 lay pressed together, one clutching a battered teddy bear with stuffing peeking out of its seam. The older child's eyes were already open, steady and watchful. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, carrying a weight no child should carry. "You don't have to take both of us," she whispered. "Just her. She's nicer." The words struck him harder than any blow. His knees gave out, the pavement biting through his tailored slacks as he crouched before them. He searched her face, waiting for some hint that it was a game, but her expression was serious, practiced, as if she had repeated those words too many times before. He could barely breathe. "Why would you say that?" he asked, voice breaking. She shrugged lightly, her small shoulders lifting with weary indifference. That's what the last man said. He could not take both. The alley around him blurred, every sound muffled beneath the pounding of his heart. He asked their names, desperate for something to anchor him. "Gracie," she said at last, pointing to the girl asleep at her side. "That's Lily." Her voice softened when she added, "She gets sick sometimes, but she always wakes up." Vincent swallowed, his throat raw. He wanted to call someone. The police. Shelter. Anyone. Yet the thought of walking away, even to seek help, filled him with dread. These children had already known too much abandonment. It was written in their stillness, in the flatness of Gracie's voice. "I have a car," he whispered. "It is warm. I can bring food, water." Gracie did not answer, only pulled Lily closer. In that moment, Vincent felt the old ache of his own loss tear open. He remembered his daughter Sophie, 8 years old, with the kind of smile that could light every corner of a room. He remembered the phone call, the furnace failure at the lodge, the silence that followed, the grief that carved through his life and left only shadows behind. And now, here were 2 girls in a box, abandoned to the cold, carrying words no child should ever say. It felt like the universe itself had placed them in his path, demanding an answer. He shrugged off his wool coat and laid it gently across their small forms. Gracie adjusted it to cover her sister's legs without a word. "I will bring food," Vincent said. "I will come back." Her eyes narrowed, old beyond her years. "People always say that," she replied. "Then, they don't." Vincent felt something harden inside him. A vow formed not from reason, but from something deeper. He met her gaze and whispered, "I am not people." The words lingered in the damp air, fragile yet unshakable. For the first time in years, Vincent felt the stirrings of something alive within him, something stronger than the grief that had bound him. As he stood, heart pounding, he realized the choice had already been made. He would not leave them behind. Not tonight. Not ever. The next morning came not with peace, but with a restless urgency that drove Vincent back to Birchwood Street before dawn. He had spent the night pacing his penthouse, haunted by the image of two small girls curled together in a sagging box, their voices echoing through his mind like ghosts. By 4 a.m., he was already in his car, his coat, still missing, wrapped around Lily. He was not sure what he expected to find. Perhaps the alley would be empty, leaving him to wonder if it had been some dream conjured by grief. But no, they were there. Gracie looked up at him as if she had known he would return. Her voice was quiet, but the words carried the weight of years. "You came back." This time, Vincent did not hesitate. He knelt beside them and opened a bag of food he had brought. Warm sandwiches, the kind a child might eat half asleep at the kitchen table. Gracie tore it open quickly, handing the first piece to her sister before taking a bite herself. They did not thank him, not with words. Hunger spoke for them, their hands trembling as they ate, not from fear, but from emptiness too deep to hide. Vincent sat beside them, his back against the cold brick wall, listening to the faint hum of traffic and the buzz of a flickering street lamp. For the first time since Sophie's funeral, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. It was then that Gracie pointed beyond the dumpster. "She is over there," she said. Vincent's stomach tightened. He walked slowly, the air heavy with the scent of oil and wet paper. Behind a pile of broken pallets lay a woman, pale and curled in on herself. Her breathing was so shallow, it was barely visible. She looked impossibly young, yet worn down by 1,000 storms. Her fingers clutched a threadbare blanket as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "Ava," Gracie whispered from behind him. "Her name is Ava, but she does not say it anymore." Vincent crouched, his hands trembling. He asked how long she had been like this. Gracie shrugged, her eyes blank. "She stopped eating days ago. Said her chest hurt. No one helped. We tried a clinic once. They wanted money." Her words were too steady, too resigned. Vincent felt rage and sorrow collide inside him, a helpless fury he had not felt since the day of the accident. He pulled out his phone and called for an ambulance. When the paramedics asked about family, he did not hesitate. "They are with me," he said. The girls clung to each other as Ava was lifted onto a stretcher. Lily whimpered, holding her teddy bear tight, as though it could anchor her mother to life. Gracie stood silently, her hand gripping her sister's so firmly that Vincent could see the whiteness in her knuckles. As they climbed into the ambulance, Vincent followed, his chest heavy with a truth he could no longer avoid. He was responsible now. At the hospital, Vincent moved with a determination that startled even him. He gave his name, pulled strings, and within minutes, Ava was in intensive care. He stood at her bedside as machines hummed, watching the fragile rise and fall of her chest. The girls waited outside the glass door, too young to enter. Vincent looked at them, small and weary in chairs that swallowed their frames, and felt his heart splinter. Their silence was the kind that screamed louder than any sound. Hours later, a doctor told him Ava was severely dehydrated, malnourished, her body weak but not beyond saving. It would take time, patience, and resources. Vincent's answer was immediate. "Do whatever it takes. I will cover everything." The doctor nodded, but Vincent saw the surprise in his eyes. People rarely spoke with such certainty when the subject was not their own blood. That night, Vincent led the girls into his penthouse. The space, once immaculate and cold, now felt foreign even to him. He carried Lily, still half asleep, into a guest room rarely touched. Gracie followed with her duffel bag clutched like a shield. He tucked them in, the silence between them heavy but fragile, like something that might break if pressed too hard. As he turned to leave, he noticed a small crayon drawing left on the nightstand. 3 stick figures, uneven but hopeful, with one word scrawled in shaky purple letters, home. The next days unfolded like fragments of a life he had never imagined. Vincent rearranged his entire schedule. He canceled meetings, postponed retreats, and told his assistant simply, "This comes first." In the mornings, he found Gracie waiting quietly at the counter, her hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands, accepting oatmeal as though it were a gift from another world. Lily followed soon after, dragging her bear across the polished floor, her eyes still watchful but no longer as distant. Slowly, the walls began to soften. Each moment carried its own quiet revelation. A drawing tucked into his briefcase of a lighthouse with the words, "The light never goes out," a whispered plea from Lily in the middle of the night. "Just do not go." A sudden hug so brief it might have been missed if not for the way it stopped his heart. Vincent taped their pictures to his desk, folded them into his wallet, and placed them beside the only photo of Claire and Sophie he still kept close. The past and present no longer felt like separate worlds. By the time Ava opened her eyes again, weeks later, the bond had already been woven. The girls had begun to laugh, soft at first, then louder, spilling into the halls with the kind of joy Vincent had not heard in years. They built forts out of couch cushions, left crayons scattered across the counters, and sang lullabies off-key. The penthouse, once sterile and silent, grew cluttered and alive. Vincent found himself watching it all with a wonder he did not dare name. When Ava finally whispered her daughter's names in the hospital room, tears streaking her face, Vincent stood at the door, his voice caught in his throat. Gracie explained who he was. Lily added softly, "We call him, maybe Dad." Ava's gaze lingered on him with caution, then softened just enough to whisper, "Thank you." For Vincent, it was not gratitude that struck him most, but the realization that he had already crossed an invisible threshold. He was no longer an outsider looking in. He was part of the story now, bound to it by choice, by love, and by a promise he had no intention of breaking. When Ava returned home from the hospital, the penthouse no longer looked like the untouched fortress it had once been. The walls were no longer silent. They carried the sounds of laughter spilling down the hallway, of crayons scraping across paper, of feet pattering across marble floors. To most outsiders, Vincent Hale still lived in the same high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Phoenix skyline. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The sterile air had been replaced with warmth, clutter, and the fragile rhythm of a family beginning again. Ava was still weak. Her voice sometimes faltered, her steps unsteady, but her presence carried a quiet strength. She watched her daughters play in spaces that once echoed with silence, her smile tentative but real. Vincent, careful not to hover, learned to notice without pity. He saw the way her hands shook as she folded laundry, the way she paused when standing too long. He heard the catch in her breath when she tried to keep up with her daughter's energy. Each time, he stepped in not to rescue her, but to steady her, as if reminding her she was not alone anymore. One afternoon, while Ava rested, Vincent cleared out an old media room. The walls that once displayed stock charts and architectural renderings were painted a bright yellow. Fairy lights draped across the ceiling, bookshelves filled with puzzles and paints, a modest upright piano placed in the corner. When the girls walked in, their faces lit with wonder. Gracie named it the sunroom, and from that day forward, it became the heart of the home. There, Lily's voice returned in hesitant lullabies. Gracie's drawings filled the walls, and Ava sat on soft beanbags reading stories as her strength returned. The transformation was not only in the rooms but in the girls themselves. At first, their movements carried the reflexes of survival, flinching at sudden sounds, clutching each other too tightly in the dark. But slowly, trust began to seep in. Breakfasts were filled with giggles over burnt pancakes. Evenings ended with the sound of pages turning during story time. Lily, once silent, began whispering secrets into her bear's ear, and sometimes into Vincent's. Gracie, cautious and wise beyond her years, started to allow herself the smallest pieces of childhood she had once guarded fiercely. It was during one of those evenings that Lily handed Vincent a drawing, folded carefully into quarters. Inside, 3 stick figures stood beneath a wide sun, their hands linked, with one word scrawled above them, in uncertain letters: us. Vincent folded it slowly, pressing it as if it were fragile glass, and promised to keep it in his office. Lily looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "It is not that good." He shook his head, his voice warm. "It is perfect." She reached out then, her small hand brushing against his, and for a moment, the world stilled. Weeks turned into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Vincent worked less, choosing instead to spend mornings helping with art projects or evenings learning the clumsy chords of lullabies on the piano. His assistant stopped asking questions, labeling his absences simply as personal leave. For Vincent, this was not absence from work, it was the presence of life. He taped their drawings beside old photos of Claire and Sophie, not to replace the past, but to weave it together with the present. Then came the moment Ava finally spoke the words that sealed everything. Sitting on the couch with a blanket draped across her lap, her daughters building towers from cereal boxes at her feet, she turned to Vincent. Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. "I want shared guardianship," she said. "If I cannot be strong enough, I want to know you will still be here." Vincent did not need to think. He had already chosen long before. He don't? Nodded, his answer simple and steady. "I already am." The girls sensed the shift long before it was written on paper. They stopped asking if they would be moved tomorrow, stopped whispering fears of waking up back in the alley. They decorated the penthouse as if claiming it, hanging paper cranes from windows, pinning watercolor clouds to the walls. They left socks in corners, crayons uncapped on counters, fingerprints across the glass. To Vincent, each mark was a sign of belonging, proof that the house had finally become a home. One evening, after a chaotic birthday celebration filled with lopsided crowns and chocolate cake that nearly collapsed in the oven, Lily climbed into Vincent's lap, heavy-eyed and unsteady. Her voice was soft but clear. "I am glad you saw our box," she whispered. His throat tightened as he kissed the top of her head. "You were never just a box, Lily. You were the doorway." She smiled faintly before drifting into sleep, her small hand still curled against his chest. Later that night, Ava joined him on the patio beneath the glow of the city lights. She reached for his hand, her fingers thin but steady. "Sometimes home is not a place," she said softly. "It is a person who never gave up on you." Vincent looked at her, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "Then I guess we are home." As spring settled over Phoenix, the family grew into a new rhythm. Ava regained her strength, her laughter filling spaces that had been silent for years. She began working part-time at the library, reading stories to children on Saturday mornings. Lily and Gracie sat proudly in the front row, their faces glowing as their mother's voice rang steady and strong. Vincent sat quietly in the back, his eyes meeting Ava's between pages, the silence between them filled with meaning too deep for words. There were mismatched mugs in the kitchen, music drifting from the sunroom, laughter bouncing off marble floors. The walls bore new art, and the air carried the unmistakable pulse of belonging. One day, Vincent returned home to find a small wooden sign mounted outside the gate, hand-painted in uneven strokes, glitter catching the Sunday. It read, "The Hale Family, where love lives." The letters were crooked, the paint smudged, but to Vincent, it was more beautiful than any polished plaque his wealth could buy. He touched it gently, his smile reaching his eyes, for the first time in years. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep and Ava rested beside him, Vincent stood in the quiet of the hallway, looking at a row of drawings pinned along the wall. One showed 3 figures beneath a glowing sundae. Another spelled the words, "We belong here." He folded one carefully, slipping it into his wallet beside the old photograph of Claire and Sophie. For the first time, he understood something his grief had never allowed him to believe. This was not a replacement, not a second chance at what was lost. This was a beginning. The cardboard box that once held despair had given way to something extraordinary. It had become the doorway to family, to healing, to love reborn in the most unexpected of places. There are moments in life when the world seems to pause, when time itself bends to reveal something we are not meant to ignore. For Vincent Hale, that moment came not in the boardroom, not under chandeliers or on stages built for applause, but in a forgotten alley where two small girls clung to each other inside a cardboard box. It was there, in the silence of their resilience, and in the trembling plea of a child who had learned too early to offer herself away, that Vincent's grief began to break open. The journey that followed was not a miracle in the way stories often promise. It was raw and uneven, filled with hospital visits, quiet fears, and nights where trust had to be earned inch by inch. But within those fragile steps, something unshakable was built. Vincent discovered that family does not always arrive through bloodlines or perfect timing. Sometimes it is born in the choice to stay when it would be easier to walk away. Sometimes it is found in the courage to hold a trembling hand and say, "You are safe now." Ava, weakened but unbroken, returned to her daughters with the strength of a mother who had carried too much for too long. Gracie, wise beyond her years, slowly allowed herself to be a child again. Her drawings filling walls that once stood bare. Lily, once silent, found her voice in lullabies and whispers of hope. And Vincent, a man who believed his heart had died the day he lost his wife and daughter, discovered that love does not vanish with loss. It waits quietly, aching to be awakened again. The home they built together was not flawless. It was messy, cluttered with crayons, laughter, and the ordinary chaos of life. Yet in that imperfection lived something sacred. A room painted yellow, a sign that read, "Where love lives," a word scrawled in uneven letters home. These were not symbols of wealth or success, but proof that healing is possible, that even in the deepest grief, life can bloom again. And maybe that is the truest lesson of all. That no act of compassion is too small, that choosing to see, to stop, to breathe, with someone in their darkest moment can transform not only their life, but our own. Vincent thought he had lost everything. But in choosing not to walk past that box, he found a family. He found purpose. He found a beginning. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected ways love can return, we invite you to join us. Subscribe to the Retold Stories and become part of a community that believes in the power of empathy, hope, and second chances. Because somewhere out there, someone is waiting not for a miracle, but for someone who will simply stay.